Anonymous Coward asks, does Bitcoin have a whale problem? Bloomberg reported that 1,000 investors control about 40% of Bitcoin. Will the distribution of wealth improve over time? Bloomberg reported that. I read that article. It was a quote from one of their sources that was not in any way verified and had absolutely nothing to prove it. And then it was backed up by a study, and this study had some fundamental flaws in it. And it's one of these studies that is circulating, which shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how Bitcoin works. So you get these studies out there that say things like, just 1,000 addresses control 60% of the coins in circulation. But they don't say just 1,000 addresses. That's buried in the actual study. The headline is 1,000 people control most of Bitcoin. And they make this leap between addresses and people, or accounts and people, or addresses and accounts. And these things are absolutely not equivalent. So Bloomberg has absolutely no way of knowing how many investors control how much Bitcoin. None of us have any way of knowing that information. You can't tell. If you see a very large transfer to an exchange from a single Bitcoin address, does that mean it's one person? Absolutely not. That could be another exchange buying a very large amount of Bitcoin or selling a very large amount of Bitcoin so it can balance its hot wallet or its cold wallet or something like that. So that one address could be an address that belongs to an exchange. Perfect example. Coinbase has 12 million, 14 million, however many millions of customers. Do you think they have 14 million addresses? Well, they do. They do have 14 million receive addresses, or they can generate 14 million receive addresses. But if you actually trace a transaction, what happens is when a transaction comes in on one of these receive addresses, say the receive address that's connected to my account in their database, the funds get swept very, very quickly in a batch transaction that sends them all into a cold storage address, as they should be. You don't want to be holding that in a hot wallet. And those funds get swept into cold storage, and they do not have 12 million cold storage addresses. That would be both inefficient and insecure. They probably have hundreds at most cold storage addresses because it's very difficult to manage all of the keys of cold storage addresses. Most exchanges have several orders of magnitude fewer cold storage addresses. So when you look at that on the blockchain, 14 million customers at Coinbase and all of the Bitcoin that they hold appears to be under, I don't know, 100 Bitcoin addresses. Does that mean 100 people own that? No, 14 million people own that. Simultaneously, on the flip side of that, I have wallets that have hundreds of addresses in them, just because they've done a lot of very, very small transactions with change and back and forth and back and forth. For example, when I give out $2 or $3 to people I meet at conferences or meetups, that generates a lot of churn with addresses in my wallet. And there may be change addresses, hundreds of change addresses. So now you've got hundreds of addresses belonging to one person. And then you've got one address belonging to millions, or hundreds of addresses belonging to millions, which means just by looking at what percentage of money is stored in what percentage of addresses, you cannot draw any conclusion about the number of people who control that money, the number of people who are whales, or any of that. This article that has been circulating and the analysis that it was based on, which said that I think 4% of the accounts in Bitcoin, and if you hear the word account, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. 4% of the accounts in Bitcoin control 60% of, I don't remember what the numbers were. That was one of the articles that got sucked into this Bloomberg article. It's a bit disappointing because that journalist has done good work in the past. both of those have been circulating a lot. They're very poorly done. They have very little scientific basis. They draw conclusions that cannot be drawn scientifically from the assumptions and data that they have. They have some data, and then from that data, they reach an assumption that is absolutely not supportable by the data. And then they take just that final conclusion, if you want, and they stick it in the headline and make it the sensational headline. This is what this is called in sign language. If anybody speaks sign, I want to see what you think on the